Good afternoon. My name is Chris Smith. I'm a congressman from the state of New Jersey. I chair the Committee on Global Health and Global Human Rights, and I thank you all for coming out today. More than 20 years ago, the U.S. Congress approved and the President signed legislation that I had authored called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, a comprehensive whole-of-government initiative to combat sex and labor trafficking in the United States and around the world. The TVPA created a bold and domestic and international anti-human trafficking strategy and established scores and scores of new programs to prosecute traffickers, protect victims, and prevent trafficking in the first place, as we often call it, the 3 Ps. Though it is hard to believe now, my legislation was met with a wall of skepticism and opposition, outright opposition, dismissed by many as a solution in search of a problem. For most people at that time, including many lawmakers, the term trafficking applied almost exclusively to drugs and weapons, not human beings. Reports of vulnerable persons, especially women and children, being reduced to commodities for sale were often met with surprise, incredulity, or indifference. We overcame all of that. We persisted, and the bill was signed into law on October 28, 2000, and is now making, I think, a huge difference. But once again, ladies and gentlemen, there are those who would ignore the real evidence that children are needlessly being put at risk for child trafficking. It's like deja vu. You don't see it, you close your eyes, you look askance, and as if it's not really happening. Due to failed open border policies of the Biden administration, we now must address the tens of thousands, really hundreds of thousands, of unaccompanied minors now at risk for trafficking and abuse. Since early 2021, approximately 345,000 unaccompanied children have crossed the border into the United States, placing them in the custody of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, which pursues either repatriation or safe long-term housing. At least that's what it purports to do within the United States. Among the children under their jurisdiction and settled, they have lost contact, they being ORR, about 85,000 children, unaccompanied minors. They don't know where they are, and their well-being and whereabouts is completely unknown. Without any sources of contact, these children, many have endured countless risks, could be immediate and in grave danger and at risk of death, child exploitation and abuse, and severe forms of trafficking in persons, including forced labor and sex trafficking, or both. Failure to report will result in penalties to DHS, HHS, and the FBI of $10,000 per day. It is imperative that the executive branch locate and assess the well-being of these minors, and we must reform our border security policies to ensure this unprecedented migration pattern does not continue. I urge my colleagues to co-sponsor and the Biden administration to finally be accountable for these failures. We are joined here today at this press conference by one of the most outstanding advocates I have ever met, and I've been in this movement since 1995 of combating human trafficking, whose life experience provided the foundation of the recently released film called The Sound of Freedom, and that would be Tim Ballard. On May 14th, 2015, I first met Tim as he testified at one of my hearings on what? Child sex trafficking. He told us then how he had served for 12 years as a special agent for the Department of Homeland Security's Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force and the Sex Tourism Jump Team, and worked as an undercover operative infiltrating organizations at home and abroad that were abusing the trafficking and trafficking children. He told us, however, that he felt helpless by the fact that the vast majority of those child victims that he would find fell outside the purview of the United States. Unless I could tie a U.S. traveler to the case, he said, I would not be able to rescue the child. That's when he formed his own organization. He's been working on it ever since, and working with the Colombians. You might, if you saw the movie, you would be really moved by this. Tim pulled off one of the largest rescue operations ever. More than 120 victims, child victims, as young as 11 in just one day were rescued. Tim's heroic life-saving work rescuing children from the extreme cruelty of sex trafficking, almost always has a great physical risk to himself, is the stuff of legends. You know, we use the word hero far too often in public life. This man is a hero. Stories like Tim Ballard and the film The Sound of Freedom I believe, will not only inform and educate, but it's motivating. More and more people who watch it say, my God, it's happening right under our nose. We need to do something, and we need to do a lot about it. So I want to introduce Tim Ballard, and then my colleague will say a few words, and some of our other guests. But Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll start out by asking you this question. This is a very important question that everyone in this country needs to ask themselves. If a child were found unaccompanied in New York City, in Washington, D.C., in San Diego, you pick the city, what does that unaccompanied child who's been abandoned, who's all alone, what does that child deserve? That child deserves to be protected. And I can tell you that child likely would be protected in any one of those cities. Guarded, protected. If anyone came to pick that child up, there's going to be a background check. There's going to be a DNA test. There's going to be extensive research into whoever's claiming to be the guardian of this child. Now, why is that so important, especially in the United States? Unfortunately, the United States is the #1 country in consuming child exploitation material in the entire world. In other words, per capita, we might have the most pedophiles than any other country. Even more reason why any American child who appears unaccompanied in a city deserves our protection. So my question for this administration, why will you not, at the very least, give these foreign children that same protection? You're giving them no protection, hardly any at all. In fact, what you're giving them is a joke. These children show up unaccompanied. Over 300,000 over the last several years. Where are they? 85,000, according to Health and Human Services, who had them at one point, disappeared into the belly of the country that consumes more child exploitation material than any other country on the planet. This should horrify every American. Why are we doing this? We don't need to do this. We have the resources. We refuse to enforce the borders. Last week, I had the unique opportunity to spend a day with the president of Honduras, President Castro, and the next day I went to Guatemala and I met with President Giamatti, the president of Guatemala. Now, interestingly, because unfortunately everything in this country is so political, politics over children, unfortunately, is what we're doing in this country. Interestingly, President Castro of Honduras is very socialist. The president of Guatemala is very conservative. And yet they told me the exact same thing. Their children and their women are being put in a situation that is terrifying. And it's all thanks to who? To the United States of America. Because we open our borders and it's a vacuum. The traffickers love us. According to the New York Post, the traffickers along the Mexican border are making $14 million a day. I believe that. I spent 10 years on that border. I believe it. Millions are coming through these countries. They can't handle all the movement of the countries. Children are being lost along the way. And those children end up at our borders. And what happens? These kids show up. I've been there. I've seen it. A piece of paper may be tied to their shirt with a safety pin or in their pocket with a name and a number, the sponsor. Health and Human Services, they are ordered. It's not their fault. Border Patrol, DHS. I work for DHS. These are great men and women. They're being ordered by this administration to do what they're doing. And what is that? I hate to say this, but they have become child trafficking delivery services that human traffickers and child traffickers are able to utilize. They're smarter than we think. They know our stupid policies are allowing them to make millions of dollars. And so they attach a little name to the kid. Or someone calls in and says, I'm the sponsor. Now the administration is going to say, well, we do look at documents. Really? How long? They'll tell you they don't have time to look at it that closely. You know how easy it is to forge documents? I propose to you that foreign children are children of God. Just as much as any American child is a child of God. And they deserve the exact same protection that any U.S. child should deserve. Background checks, DNA, run the whole gamut. Do not release these children into the United States. 85,000 are missing, and that's thanks to the Biden administration. They did this, and thanks to Congressman Smith and the sponsors of this bill, we're going to go find those children. and we're going to prevent any other child from being subjected to what is really slavery in our nation. This is despicable. We should drop everything to fix this problem before anything else we talk about. This should be the headlines every single day until we end this problem. Human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal enterprise on the face of the earth. There's close to 30 million people, according to the State Department, according to the UN, people in slavery. And millions of those children, millions of those slaves are children. And their traffickers are trying to get them into this market, this black market, our land, our country. It's time to rise up. It's time to support Congressman Chris Smith, who's done more, in my opinion, more than anyone in Congress, more than anyone maybe in American history on the legislative side, to end the abuse of children. And so I'm so grateful to stand by his side, because we need to stand by these children, and he's standing by these children. Because at the end of the day, the iconic line in the film Sound of Freedom by the actor Jim Caviezel, who plays me, he says something that's very important. I'll end with this line. We do all of this because God's children are not for sale. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank the sponsor, my colleague, Congressman Smith, and Tim for your work in this space. You know, having worked for a small nonprofit that dealt in the space of combating child trafficking, you know, I have some firsthand experience of the horrors that is. You know, there are fewer horrors in the world than heartbreaking than human trafficking and child trafficking. And I literally was just in Arizona. I flew unannounced to Tucson with my own security team, unannounced to the Border Patrol. And not only did we pop in, but we went into the area that's controlled by the cartel. And over 100 people turned themselves into us looking for refuge, myself and my security team. And as I crossed over the fence and I went to a small encampment where there were blankets and water and what you would expect to find from migrants on their journey, also found a package of birth control pills from a young woman who couldn't afford the full fare. So she takes birth control so she can help work off what she owes. This billion-dollar industry is booming in the United States because of this feckless administration. I was in Arizona. You have miles and miles and miles of fence. And roughly every quarter mile, our government has cut out sections. And one of these so-called deer crossings, I'm a country boy from Tennessee. I know what deer tracks look like. So I looked at this deer crossing. There were no deer tracks. There were human footprints. There were carpet shoes used by cartel members to hide their footprints. But there were no deer. This administration has opened our borders. 6 million people have come in under this administration. Countless women and children will be raped today because of this administration. Every murder, every rape, every assault, and every burglary that takes place in this country at the hands of illegals, the Biden administration is culpable. So I say this. We must find these children. Roughly 85,000 unaccompanied minors that were let loose by this country and now are being victimized. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And like Tim and like Chris, I will continue to fight for those that are being victimized, those that are being trafficked, and ultimately, the first step in a solution is securing the border. Regardless of where you are at on the immigration issue itself, these children are here because the wall has literally been cut down. And Biden, that's your fault. Thank you.
My name is Roger Severino, Vice President for Domestic Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Right around July, we hosted a screening of the Sound of Freedom movie at the Heritage Foundation. And we invited Congressman Chris Smith and other members of Congress to come watch and see, to hear Tim Ballard's story. Eduardo Verástegui, the producer, was there as well. And after the movie, where you have tears streaming from people in the audience, we all looked at each other and said, well, we have to do something. And America has been captivated by this movie, this underdog story, because it's based on reality, and their hearts have been touched. And we would be remiss if we as a nation didn't do something to help the children that are victims of international sex trafficking. So Eduardo Verástegui and I, Congressman Smith, said, what can we do? Congressman Smith said, well, can't we pass a law? He's been the leader on this issue for decades. So we provided the assistance for the Secure Act, which would hold HHS accountable for their job. You know, Secretary of HHS has said that they were treating kids as part of an assembly line and handing them over to these sponsors within 30 days, in and out, because they had to process them because the border was flooded with these unaccompanied children. And think what it takes, the desperation for somebody to leave their child in the hands of, by definition, at the very least, a smuggler. And these smugglers, of course, are part of criminal cartels that includes sex trafficking. We want to avoid the American government being part and parcel of assisting with human trafficking and especially the sex trafficking of children. So we have these sponsors that show up with inadequate vetting that are not being fingerprinted, the children being handed over within 30 days, and 85,000 of them are unaccounted for. 85,000 kids were in government custody at HHS, and we don't know where they are. They have to be found. The Secure Act is designed to make sure that the FBI, DHS, and HHS use their resources to first find these children, find out if they are at risk for sex trafficking, or if they've already been victims of sexual abuse. Now, we pray that those kids are safe, but we have strong reason to believe, based on the experience of Tim Ballard and others, that they are not safe, that they are in grave danger. So this bill is designed to address that problem. And once we find out what happened to these kids, and if we discover that they've been harmed, there has to be follow-up in terms of great policies to secure our borders. Because it's not more than just these 85,000. It's the next 85,000 kids that are in line, that are in the hands of smugglers now, that may also be victims of sex trafficking. And it has to end. The sooner, the better.
Any questions?
We were talking about earlier about identifying the children to make sure that who they are given to is truly their family member. And that came up during the last administration, concern about holding on to DNA samples. Is there a compromise that could be made there?
Sure. Think of what we do with children in adoption circumstances. It's not just DNA evidence. If somebody's given up for adoption, they do interviews and home studies. It's a thorough process because we want to make absolutely sure whatever child is in the custody and care of the government is released to somebody who will be at least as careful in taking care of the health and well-being. Right? I was at HHS. I was the head of the Civil Rights Office there, and we know what the procedures are. We know how it's done. The corners have been cut because of the flood at our borders. When we have open borders and you don't have the infrastructure to deal with the massive amount of unaccompanied children, as young as 5 years old, showing up at our border, they've been cutting corners. So they're not doing the proper vetting. They're certainly not fingerprinting all the potential sponsors. And the way you do the fingerprinting is necessary to do a proper background check, which I'm sure Tim Ballard, you want to talk a bit about what background checks look like? Why?
I appreciate what Roger Severino just said. I adopted 2 children that we rescued in February 2014 from Haiti. They joined my other 7 biological children. I know the care that the U.S. government, the State Department puts in to making sure that I'm a safe zone, that my wife and I are safe. We rescued the kids, for heaven's sake. And even we had to go through a process that I appreciated. Home studies, background checks, fingerprints, criminal checks. It was extensive. It took years. Okay. And I'm going to reiterate what I said before. Why would a foreign child deserve any less than an American child? Will anyone, Mr. Biden, Mr. President, will you stand and say right now that an American child deserves better than a foreign child? I want you to answer that question. We all know the answer is false. When it comes to children especially, Do borders and boundaries matter at all? They don't matter at all. These are children. They should all deserve the same. Now you're going to say, well, we can't. Tim, it's not my fault. There's too many, there's flood of migrants. Well, guess what? That's because you're not enforcing the laws that Congress has placed upon you. I enforced those laws for 10 years on that border. Enforce the laws and the vacuum disappears. You suck the wind out of the sails of child traffickers. They will no longer kidnap children and bring them to our border if the borders aren't open. It's very simple. And so it all goes back to the policy. Enforce the borders, suck the wind out of the sails, the traffickers, and the children will stay with their families. And that's it. It's that simple.
Yes, ma'am.
I was told with NTV television. So how do you think the end of Title 42 has influenced the level of human trafficking at our border, if at all? And also, how confident are you about passing the Secure Act in the Senate, especially amid a veto threat from the White House?
There's no doubt that letting Title 42 run out has every action that is taken by the administration that creates an engraved invitation for people to make their way to the border, believing that it will be very easy to cross it and then become part of this society. But it raised such risk getting there. I met with the president of Guatemala about a year ago and asked him about the long trek that these, especially women and children, make. He said 80% of the women and children were sexually abused somewhere along the line. Maybe at the end, they're sold into modern day slavery, sex trafficking, or by the cartels as they're making their way. So, there's all kinds of actions that lead to people saying, aha, now I can go do it. Certainly the COVID restriction had some very little, in my opinion, chilling effect. But the issue really is, we do, and that's why we're here today. There's 85,000 kids, maybe it's more, who are unaccompanied. That as both Roger and Tim just very eloquently, the comparisons with adoption, great money. You want to vet the people who are telling us, yeah, that's fine, and they take it, but who knows where they're going? Who's doing it? And since there's such a large number, that leads to the propensity for lots of mistakes to be made. And we think a lot have been made, but go and look. This would find the FBI, DHS, and HHS and Department of Homeland Security every day that they're late with their report. It continues these reports so we get a full accounting. We're not kidding. If we say there's no fine for not reporting, good luck. We'll never get the report. I mean, there's got to be some enforcement there too. So penalties, I think, will help sharpen their minds. And you would hope, from a humanitarian point of view, that they would say, you're right, let's go do that. They don't even need the law to do that. We're going to try very hard to get this passed, and I do think we will.
On the question specifically about the Senate and the president, we're talking about 85,000 children. This should be a bipartisan issue that has unanimous support. We're talking about 85,000 children are being victimized. So if you vote against this, you're supporting child rape. I'm going to lay it out that clearly. If Biden vetoes this, he is supporting child rape. We have 85,000 children in this country that are unaccounted for. All we're asking is a clear process and mandate for accountability, nothing more. This isn't about building a wall. This isn't about amnesty. This is about children and finding them.